Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Most welcome on Brutally Honest with VRA. So wonderful to do this conversation because I've been very interested in temples, especially Hindu temples. I'm Buddhist also. I practically go everywhere. Wherever I feel spiritual, I go there. But then once I go to Himalayas very often, and once I was trekking, and after trekking, my guide, the guy who walks with you, he said कि वहाँ दूर कहीं पे there is some ancient temple, once I was going and I found it. So I said, chalo, let's go there. And I went there. And it was like dark black stone cut out of one large rock. Not a very huge temple, a small, more like a very localized kind of thing. Maybe more for a tribe. When I say tribe, not psychologically, but tribe more demographically, means a small group of maybe 100 or 200 people must have lived there. So it was small, very small, like a Mumbai apartment, from 800 square meter thing. But when I sat there, the stone, the feel of the stone, the temperature of the stone was so different from it was cold outside, but it was not so cold. And when I sat over there, and that's when I realized one thing, that temples are not just places of worship. Because this temple, there was nobody, no pujari. I can guarantee nobody has been there in many years. And because tourists don't go there, it wasn't dirty, it was very clean. But I then looked at all the sculpting which was done over there. And I said, temples are not just places of worship or spiritual practice, but they are also great pieces of architecture. And that made me think that after independence in last 70 years, after British left us, have we created any great monument, a great piece of architecture, something which we can say is 100% Indian thought, Indian thinking, and which also gives you a spiritual kind of a feeling? And sorry, none. And since then, I started visiting temples. Honestly, before that, I generally refrained, because temple, when we say, the kind of image which a urban person would get is these typical commercial mandirs जहाँ पे हजारों लोग जाते हैं, modern mandirs made by Birlas or made by Singhanias, और उनके बाहर भी बहुत गंदा होता है, और अंदर everybody just wants to fleece you of money and all that. So these modern colorful temples is what normally 90-95% of the population imagines when you say temple. But when you start going to these temples, the real heritage temples, Khajuraho's, Konarks, or Pallavas and Cholukyas, the thing is, if you take the people, the audience, make them evolve more intellectually, then they will start talking about Konark and the sculpting and the Khajuraho, the detailing of Khajuraho, the spiritual part of it. And now, because of political debates, people have learned more about Hindu temples. But honestly, if you see India as a whole, then the knowledge about Pallavas and Chalukyas is hardly anywhere. And this is the coffee table book both of you have written. And that's why, so let me just first begin with that. Actually, I was delighted to go through every single page, every photo I looked at for a long time. I went back into a few pages and I tried to understand it. You have done a great job. Who writes such kind of coffee table books anymore? So, just to understand, I am told both of you never met while before writing or while writing, I don't know. First of all, tell me, what is that magic or magic code you guys have found that you could do it? Let's understand that part first.
We still haven't met, actually.
Oh, really?
We've only ever met like this.
Then tell me the logistics and the mechanics, how you worked it out, how it happened, and how you got connected that you said, okay, let's write a book, because writing a book is a very dangerous territory. You can lose friends forever, or you can, So how did it work out?
So the architect of the book is actually not in the discussion today. It was Dimple's vision which actually brought us both together, I must say. because we used to do Twitter threads on the places that we visited, and so Dimple contacted us and said, "There's a book in the two of you. You're putting out information which is, one day your account goes, something gets deleted, it's all lost. You have to put it together in a format that is available for people to see." Even though it's mainly photographic, but there's a lot of historical content. There is a lot of content about all the elements that you spoke about, be it the architecture, the sculpting, the technology used, the history of the temples, and generally each of these temples also has a Sthala Purana. It's not that the temples got built willy-nilly at any place, right? So each of these places was either a kshetra or a place where some divine event is supposed to have happened, and therefore eventually a structural form to it came into place through these temples. So she contacted us and we said, okay, we'll write. But then what do we write about? I mean, there's Pallavas, there's Cholas, there's Pandyas, there is Rashtrakutas, there is so much to write about. And then we said, these are the two kingdoms which were contemporaries and were also the beginning point for temple construction in the south. Both of them brought a very fundamental shift to how temples were constructed. There were always temples, Vivekji. There were always temples since the beginning of whatever we call Hindu civilization, in various shapes and forms, right? So the general consensus is that if you go through a Mahabharata or a Ramayana, they talk about the Chaityas. When either Yudhishthira goes on a pilgrimage or Rama goes on a pilgrimage, they talk about kshetras that they visit. But it's not just the kshetra, right? At that place, an event has taken place. And typically what is mentioned is a chaitya. Now, chaitya is a term which has been probably taken over by the Buddhists more than remains as a Hindu term. But it basically comes from piling up of bricks. And piling up of bricks used to happen when they would do yagnas, right? So that piling up of bricks eventually became a structural component, and the divinity that was there, that place because a yagna took place, or that it was a kshetra where the divine used to always manifest themselves, a temple came into being. Now, those temples were built using bricks, metal, mortar, and stuff like, and wood, and these are all perishable. So these two dynasties or these two kingdoms actually decided to shift from these perishable materials. I mean, it's difficult to imagine metal perishable or a brick perishable, but they have a certain life to them. They have a certain shelf life to them, as opposed to rock. So these two kingdoms actually decided to take rock as the fundamental building block of temples, and they started techniques and methods which eventually inspired all subsequent dynasties. And that's why we decided we'll pick these two. That's how the book came together. That's why Pallavas and Chalukyas.
But we'll come to the detailing of temples and the academic part. But Gurpreet, how did it work out? I mean, for me, I also write. It's impossible for me to imagine. I have never met anybody, just contacted on emails, and then you write the whole book and put it together. I want to understand the mechanics of that. What was the experience? Just first warm me up with that.
Sure. So Vivekji, for me personally, it was like a journey. Because I kind of started on the outside. Like whenever I would look at some of these ancient structures, I used to say they're beautiful, but I could not understand them. I could not understand the iconography of the temples, or even what the usage of the temple was. And many times these temples were being referred to as monuments or as ruins, and I was not able to really relate to them. So it started with my visits to, in fact, Mumbai is in the, in the backyard of Mumbai, we have some of the most ancient temples and cave temples. Like for instance, the Elephanta Cave Temple is a marvelous Hindu cave temple, which I visited, and it completely, I think that sculpture of Sadashiv just completely hit me. And I realized that even without knowing anything, the iconography can really influence me as a person. When I did not even know that it depicted Sadashiva at that point, or the the manifestation of the supreme form of Shiva. But it really hit me because I realized that civilizationally we were able to express our our divinities in such forms, that could really relate to the people, and that our aesthetics that we see even in the temples and in these cave temples, they were informed by our deep philosophy. So the philosophy of our civilization has mainly been the concept of this divine immanence, that divinity resides in everybody, resides in all living beings, and it's the cosmos that is at the center. It's not the man, or man is as a species is not better than any of the other species. So there are some of these concepts which you see which flow into the way we express even our gods, how we express our devotion to them. And it began as a series of visits, Vivekji, to Ellora, beginning with Ellora. And then I went to Madurai, and I had a darshan of the Devi, and I just started crying. There is no reason for which I had that experience, because I was not really a Devi worshipper at that point in time. I had not gone there for a specific reason. I happened to be in Chennai for work, and I ended up in Madurai. That's when I realized that temples are really powerful spaces, and that I need to go beyond just the look and feel of the temple, or what I'm feeling and what I can see. And then it began as a series of trips where I explored these places and I started writing about them on Twitter. And I think Dimple could see the passion with which me and Bharat were trying to express ourselves and how we were trying to learn. And some of it kind of really connected with the common people. For instance, I had this guy from Karnataka telling me that you've written about the Hoysala temples and I have never visited them. So now I'm reading your work and I'm taking my family there, and I'm able to give them some context of the Hoysala temples. So that is something that really motivated me to write more. And then Dimple, she kind of looked at both of us, and her idea was to bring a North Indian and a South Indian together for this work. And both of us had the love for temples, love for architecture, and this innate curiosity about where we came from, because the temple is a very visible manifestation of our philosophy, of our civilization. We may not realize it yet, but that is the way it is. And so she decided to put us together, and we actually started with a blank slate. We are not writers, so we had no idea whether we should focus on the sculpture, whether we should talk about how the temples were built. And somehow we just ended up picking the same time period. We thought that these are contemporary dynasties. Let's pick up the Pallavas and Chalukyas, and let's start writing about it. And I think even if you read the book, it is not going to appear very planned. So Bharat section flows in a different way, the Chalukya section flows in a different way, and that is kind of the unique nature of this book.
I was going to ask you that how did you divide your work? Because in the book, I'm also a filmmaker, writer, and I read so many scripts. So I understood that the tones were a little different, in these two parts. So you divided, like, between Pallavas and Chalukyas, you divided the work?
Yes. So Bharat worked specifically on the Pallavas, and I worked on the Chalukyas. So the first section of the book, the first 200 pages are devoted to the Pallavas, which is his style of writing. And the last 200 pages would be for the Chalukyas, which is where I've worked on. So I think it was...
And who has taken photos, maximum photos? Who has taken photos?
Both of us have taken, Vivekji. We have visited those sites and we have
taken
those photographs. Yes. Yeah. So we did that. And
you guys are not professional photographers?
No way.
So I work in the... Yeah, he works with the automobile industry, and I work in the financial industry. So we're nowhere art graduates or students in any form. This was just a curiosity.
This is what I always write about it, about creative consciousness. I do master classes on that. This is what creative consciousness is, that all of us are born creative, and it's your perspective which we need to express. But in the corporate world, we generally are busy impressing people so much that we also start saying what the template wants us to say. So it's very good to get out of your professions and do something so wonderful, And so let's just understand one thing. I mean, honestly, despite knowing so much, a lot of people would assume that I know a lot about temples because I get involved in the activism for free temples and stuff like that. But honestly, let me just confess that after reading your book, I found myself so ignorant. I didn't even... I've seen it, but I could not categorize that cave temples are different from rock temples and all these temples. There's so many kinds of temples. Why is it that a general, typically shore temples, and which I realize, yes, we have shore temples, we have mountain temples, we have all kinds of things. So first, let's understand that from both of you, and then I would like to also discuss that why a common student or young Indian doesn't know about it, or even any Indian doesn't know about it unless somebody is a scholar of temples or Hinduism or into all these things. And whereas if you travel to Europe, you will find that Europe, I'm saying not America, because Europe is very religiously inclined, and there's so many. Every city you go to, I tell my friends as a joke that whichever city you go to, the only things you get to see in Europe, a cathedral, a church, and these are their tourist attractions, and that's where you go all the times. So first, tell me about what kinds of different kinds of temples and their design elements, and just enlighten us on that.
Okay, so see the temples. So there are multiple styles of temples that you come across uh, when you go through India, and they've been kind of categorized into three main styles: Nagara, Vesara, and Dravida. Dravida is basically everything that you find in the south, and Nagara is generally what you find in the north. In fact, one of the Chalukya temples kind of combines both these styles, and you'll find that in the Chalukya section of the book. So these are broad architectural styles, but essentially the structural elements within a temple will kind of be consistent even in both these styles. There is always a Garbhagriha in which the Lord resides. The Lord is installed within the Vigraha that is put in the Garbhagriha. There will always be some mandapa structures which lead up to the Garbhagriha, and the external structure of the temple and the basic layout of the temple are also quite common, because the texts that were written somewhere around 5th, 6th, 7th century encompass some basic fundamentals in the temple construction. In fact, there is a fantastic 2-volume book written by Stella Kramrisch on Hindu temples, which kind of collects all this, the philosophy behind, and lays it out quite nicely for the layperson. As far as why uh, knowledge of these temples or fundamentals of these temples or the philosophy behind these temples are not so prevalent, I think that is something that we have definitely lost over time. Local populations are perhaps way more aware of these things than urban populations. I think urban populations, cities, etc., once we have moved, and particularly, children growing up today in the cities who hardly ever get to visit a temple, or even if they visit a temple, at least Chennai has some ancient temples. But what do you see in Delhi? Or even if you go to Mumbai, you would probably go to either temples that are now defunct and are more museum pieces than anything else. So since that connect has gone, I think over generations that knowledge base is lost. In fact, each temple encompasses a philosophy. If it's a Shaiva temple, it is an Adi Shaiva temple which follows Agamas. If it's a Vaishnava temple, then it follows a Vaishnava Sampradaya. It's either Pancharatra or Vaikhana Sagama. One of the elements of it is there. And every element of either the ritual structure of worshipping the Lord to every other activity around the temple is also dictated by those scriptural elements. But unfortunately, we've lost all that. And that's, you were speaking about activism. One of the things that we are seeing in Tamil Nadu right now is the appointment of priests of all castes in Shaiva temples, in Shivacharyas are being removed and appointed. It's a very difficult thing to counter, right? Because societally we want to see it, but the place that you're trying to do it is in a religious place. which has certain diktats and certain elements that have been encoded as part of the temple. In fact, any Shaiva temple which is installed, when it is installed, it is almost like a contract between the deity, the Shivacharya, and the king who placed the temple in place. Now, do you apply social justice to this space and say, whoever wrote it was a man, whoever installed it was a man, why shouldn't any other person or any other denomination come and take over these temples? It's a very strange thing to counter, but at the end of the day, it is an essential part of the philosophy, and it is an essential part of the religion that we all subscribe to, and therefore there are rules. It's not all rights, it's also duties. It's the Shivacharya can walk into any other temple and start becoming a priest. In fact, he won't. He will actively resist it. And there are innumerable temples in Tamil Nadu, even Shiva temples, where there is not a Shivacharya who's officiating, because that is the tradition that has been established in the temple. So what do you subscribe to? Do you subscribe to, that tradition portion of it, or do you impose the movement that society is undergoing in terms of, the larger caste issue and removing that? Are you going to impose that? My take is, of course, that the philosophy and the tradition that in which the temple was established has to remain supreme, because the Lord expects it. And to say he doesn't is simply ignoring the faith element of the religion completely. Right? So there is a tussle now on between this entire modernity and modernism and kind of social justice framework towards what is actually laid down as the rigor of the temple, as the tradition of the temple. It can very easily be cast into a different perspective, and you're being casteist or supremacist. That's not the point that is being made.
No, that is because I think the problem is that the compulsion of globalization is to make everything uniform. So all consumers, the entire market should behave in a uniform way. That's why they are trying to do this. But then I personally believe that like every product has a manual, and you follow manual religiously until the time you have learned that very well, how to operate that mechanism. Or forget that. I mean, if you take the horseness out of a horse, then the horse has no meaning, So with that unique identity, once you take that out and try to make it uniform, global kind of a belief system, then you have destroyed that. So first we have to decide whether it's part of heritage, culture. What is it? It's part of what? I think that's where Indian modern democracy has failed to recognize that they're part of what? Are they part of religion? Are they part of tradition? Are they part of architecture? Are they national monuments? What are they? Because our Hindu faith is also, Hindu practice is also so diverse. If we believe that Hindu faith and understanding is so diverse that even if you are an atheist, you are part of Hindu society, I can criticize my gods and still I can be part of this thing. I can go to church and nobody says, okay, you are a traitor or this blasphemy, or if I go to masjid, nobody says that. So, and where is that diversity coming from? It's coming from the way we have expressed it in our culture, in our food, in our attire, in our temples, our rituals, different rituals in different places. You will find two temples next to each other, just 100 meters apart, but both of them will have different rituals and different traditions, So I believe that is also part of our diversity. So when you say respect diversity, this diversity should also be respected. So I agree with you in that way.
Yeah. So Vivekji, I just like to add to this point of diversity that you just spoke about. So yes, we are diverse in many ways. Even in the manner in which we construct our temples or run them, there are different sects, and even within Shaiva temples, there are multiple sects. So it's not very simple that there is Shaiva, Vaishnava, and a Shakta temple. So every a particular, like Shaiva temple also has multiple manifestations of the, the divine deity, and you have different kind of sects managing the temples. So it's not really, I think what we are trying to do is impose the social justice or the historical colonial perception onto the current, the traditional kind of legacy that we have. And I just want to first explore why this diversity exists. This diversity exists because we as a people have accepted that there is no one way to approach divinity. There are going to be multiple ways, because divinity is present in all living beings, in all non-living beings. And if I want to worship divinity, I can do it through the worship of a Shiva Linga, I can do it through the worship of a Shiva Murti, I can do it through a yogic process. There are multiple avenues available to me. Even if I'm an atheist, I still have to believe at least in the karma framework. So when we say atheist, I don't think an atheist would be part of our cultural kind of a circle if that atheist person says, I don't even believe in the theory of karma or rebirth. So there are some things that person still believes in, what is experiential, even if you are an atheist. So that is the reason for diversity that we see, and that diversity is reflected in our temples. Now, the problem is that we have stopped looking at temples as a shared legacy, and we don't understand how temples function, what their utility is, and how they were in the past as well. So some of these things is what we've tried to kind of highlight in the book. So, for example, today's kid would not know the idea of what an agama is. What is the process of consecration? And there is this general Western colonial perception which comes from their Abrahamic worldview that all idol worship is superstition. That is firstly the thing that they say, that okay, a nirgun upasana is more superior to something that like a sagun upasana. So that is another fallacy that it exists in everybody's mind, because in our culture, in our tradition, you can do both together. And it's not that when a priest consecrates, that the divinity is only present in the murti. The priest invites the divinity to reside in the murti, and there are set yogic processes that have been developed over millennia to do that. And it's done in a cyclical fashion to ensure that you have that consecrated space functioning. And this is something that we are not aware of. Even I wasn't aware of this. I used to think that maybe just a shringar kar diya or hum worship kar rahe hain. That is not the way it works. Because also personally, when you walk into some of these temples, you have powerful experiences. So unless you are hallucinating individually, it's not possible. So it's a charged space. The construction of the temple also is done in such a symmetrical manner that it creates a mandala. It tries to focus energy. It tries to kind of reflect the cosmic man in its construction. So these are really evolved sciences. And because we are divorced from our own philosophy, we don't understand why we do the murti consecration. And that in the past, sadhakas would do both murti upasana as well as nirgun upasana, and they would not see the difference, because civilizationally our philosophy is that there is no one way. So you can do it via murti puja, you can just do it by a mantra japa, you can do a yantra worship, or you can just become a yogic student, a yogi. You can do either of these. So that diversity reflects in everything, and it definitely reflects in the freedom that was there in the manner in which temples were constructed. Of course, through the Shilpa Shastras or the Agama Shastras, but we see a big leap of creativity in our temple construction. So I think people are not aware of this, and this gap needs to be bridged, because we've been Western educated, and it took even like person like me a lot of reading and visiting the places, and really understanding how the things work there in a temple, what is the temple ecosystem. And what people don't realize is that a temple is actually, like in the past, if you look at temples, they were like the area where there was an interaction between all social communities. Okay, so it was not like only the Brahmins were the main focus. In fact, the Brahmins were very dependent. Okay, they were financially not able. Their only aim in life was to run the temple according to the agamas, do the ritual performances, and basically they would be associated with the temple universities, etc. But if you look at the locus of social interaction, it would happen across different communities, across genders. So we see these donations to the temples happening from women. Quite a few women have mentioned their names in the inscription, saying that I'm donating X so and so amount, or I am donating the inscription on this pillar or the carving on this pillar. We see trade guilds who donate to the temples in a big way. We would see agriculturists who would donate to the temple and who would also get loans from the temple, or they would like, and this is all being done not because of any tax system. This is kind of a shared ownership. You are enriching a system which is giving back to you economically. It is definitely giving back to you spiritually, and socially also. It is creating an level play field for everybody.
Yeah.
So these are some of the things which everybody
No,
just.
I really love the way both of you have explained it. In fact, I am very, very happy that you said that, because my understanding is, that this whole concept of diversity, actually, what is diversity? Diversity is that you are looking at this world from a certain perspective, and whatever you are creating around you, whatever you are creating, the thoughts, the products, the clothes, environment, is from that perspective. And what Bharat is looking at the same thing from a different perspective, and Gurpreet is looking at different perspective. Though our destination is the same, all of us want to know what is beyond this earth, what is in the space, what is beyond life, what is the truth, what is divine, is there a God or not? Even I'm a very, very strong believer in the existence of a supra divine something, and I believe that someday before I die, I might be able to discover it. But at the same time, I also question myself every single time, every morning when I walk, because I have a strong science and logical background. I also understand that yes, if I surrender to logic, then there is no God. I mean, then we are all chemical scums, and in a typical, like Stephen Hawking said, that in a typical universe, we are on a typical planet, we are typical chemical scums, that's all he said. So there is nothing extraordinary about us. We are just part of a huge, dark, cold, and hollow space. That's it. We think we are very important because that's a very anthropocentric thinking. So I believe that. So in Hindu philosophy, if you if you drop the political narrative of Hindu culture or Hindu philosophy, so that's why I would call it Hindu philosophy, because that we started as great philosophers of the world. I mean, like Greek culture, you can't think without philosophers. I don't know why in India, in our education system, we have not spoken so much about Hindu philosophy. For me, whatever you call Hindu religion today, to me, that is the highest form of human understanding, which is philosophy, in academic terms, That entire philosophy is based on the belief that, yes, this universe is very complex, and therefore it would be doing intellectual violence if you do not take many, many truths into account, which later on, it's a core Hindu philosophy is that there can be millions of ways or millions of truths, So every truth is as important as the other truth. So truth is never quantitative, that it's bigger in size because I'm the Prime Minister of India, I'm saying it, so that becomes the truth. It's always qualitative, and as a human being, our responsibility is to experiment with all these truths, and that's when we become part of a diverse biospheres, a diverse ecosystem, a diverse faith system, a diverse thought system. It's only when you experiment with more and more ideas and thoughts, then only you start understanding the complexity of the nature and of the universe, and perhaps that complexity itself is another truth, and which later on, if you know Bharat, Mahavir then brought it as a concept of Anekantvad, Anekantvad, the whole philosophy of Jainism depends on this. At the core, I mean, it begins from there. Like we begin from Sanatana, it begins from Anekantvad, and he actually said that this would be intellectual ahimsa, intellectual violence, if we do not take everybody's truth into account. So I cannot say that truth is absolute, and I know it, and that very simple thought. But I think it's also reflected in almost every part of sculpting, every part of our architecture, every part of our rituals, every part of our scriptures. Everywhere you see there are so many conflicting, complex ideas. And This is what I want to understand. Despite all this complexity, one thing I've seen in ancient Indian temples, wherever I have visited, and let me also share one experience with you. I was in Khajuraho for some literature festival. Many times I've been there, but this time I said, okay, I'll go to temples in the morning. But they open because of Archaeological Survey of India's compulsion. They open sunrise to sunset.
Hmm.
You know, and their definition of sunrise is different from the first indigo light. So when they see sun, they open it, it's like that. But I then spoke to the local people. I somehow managed. I said, I just want to be there. I want to see sun falling on the temples, because you open after the sun has already come up, and so please. So they allowed me somehow. And their main temple, I'm forgetting the name, but the main temple
Kandariya Mahadev.
Kandariya Mahadev.
in Khajuraho.
Yes. Yes.
Where you go up the steps
Yes.
and right. Yeah. So I posted those pictures also on Twitter. I made a video also. It's available on my I Am Buddha channel, especially on Khajuraho, because it was such an amazing experience. तो मैंने वहाँ जाके वहाँ बैठा. It was dark and I started meditating. And then I saw that a small ray of light fell on the outer, more like a veranda kind of thing. And then it reflected, and suddenly where I was sitting in the dark room, it suddenly became lit. And I could see things around me. This angle of light, the design, the engineering, then you have seen how how the water flows out from the temple and outside with this thing. This level of engineering, technology, because it is not just religion, it's technology, which also shows that the best of the brains work together.
Yeah.
Okay, from spiritual brains, religious and social, political, financial, technological, engineering, so many departments are involved in that. And this is everywhere you will find that how the sun is reflected inside and how much sun should be reflected inside. It's not that the whole area becomes so lit like you have come to a cathedral and it's so lit with big glasses or everywhere. And this evolved over a period of time. How did it connect from north to south, east to west, whichever temple, wherever you go, without any modern communication technologies? How we arrived at this in every part of India.
So I think the core of it actually. So both you and Gurpreet have touched upon, because that philosophy extended throughout, and that philosophy also was the core of temple construction. In fact, the Sthapati was supposed to be very well educated. The Sthapati is the person who completely constructs the temple, lays out everything, and makes sure that the temple comes into being. He was not just an expert on engineering or mathematics, but he was also an expert on the underlying philosophies. And the mandala structure has been found to be common almost among all of these temples, because divinity to be established in the Garbhagriha requires that structural cosmic man to be, or the Vastu Purusha to actually be installed through the layout. So therefore, the structural elements would always remain common when it came to moving from, when I say remain common, I'm not talking about the design elements, but specifically about where certain things have to be for divinity to manifest itself. So this thread kind of continued common, and that is why you see, after all, Vivekji, the kshetras were not, limited by geography, right? There could have been kingdoms, but still, among the 7 moksha kshetras, they are spread across north, west, east, and south. Char Dham, north, west, east, south. So the geography has always been sacred. The philosophy has always been common. The threads have always been there. So it's very, very, if anybody gives a regional argument, then it's a little bit disingenuous, to be honest. among the 7 temples, among the 7 moksha kshetras, you have Kanchi, you have Ujjain, you have Haridwar, you have Puri, you have Dwarka, right? You have Kashi. So it encompasses the entire geography of the country. If you take Char Dham, then you have all the 4 corners getting connected. So if people went on pilgrimages, they went on pilgrimages crossing kingdoms. If the philosophy went from north to south or south to north or west to east, it encompassed everything that came along the way. So it is not. It's very difficult to think of it on geographic terms. The land.
In fact, you have written somewhere that kingdoms attain great prosperity, then disappear without a trace. But these architectural masterpieces that Mahendrara and Mamlar created will remind people of their greatness for thousands of years. You have mentioned that, yeah. So yeah.
So that's actually from one of Kalki, who wrote about these about the Pallava kingdoms and the Chola kingdoms in his book. It's actually a historic novel. So he captures that conversation where they're talking about Mahabalipuram. So why is it the same? It's same because it's a one single land. It's one single sacred land. Kingdoms could have been different. Politics could have been different. But the fundamental elements of the religion, the fundamental elements of the faith were common from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from Gujarat to Bengal. So I think that's the reason why the elements always remain common.
About Mahabalipuram, you have mentioned. Sorry. Yes, good.
No. So I just want to add here, for instance, many of these bigger temples, they were like the Tirth Kshetras. So we have actually inscriptions of people visiting these Kshetras, people from other kingdoms making donations there. So definitely people would have traveled on foot or by bullock cart. They would have actually made an effort to travel to these different Tirth Kshetras. So they always connected the entire country. And these Shastras, like the Shilpa Shastras, would give you the measurements. So the temples could be constructed using those measurements or those particular symmetries, but they were going to vary regionally because, like I said, diversity is an inherent expression. So they will vary. A South Indian temple will have a pyramidal shikhara, stepped shikhara. A North Indian temple which will have a curved vertical shikhara. And actually, there were kingdoms in the south, like the Chalukyas, that were patronizing both kind of styles. Okay, so they were following Shastras. At the same time, there were these guilds of sculptors who were moving around the country. And there were these Sthapatis who were in demand across all kingdoms. If I could travel back in time, I would want to meet this one Sthapati. I'm sure he will be able to answer most of my questions regarding the temple, because he would not just be an architect, but he would be someone who's also aware of how the consecration works. Like you said, the amount of light, the amount of air that should be circulated in the Garbhagriha, the exact dimensions, amount of space that should exist for a devotee to sit and look at the the Shiva Linga or the deity enshrined in that. So everything is specified, and that is being worked upon, and just we see an evolution of that across the country. And even for another one short example I'll give you is that there is an reverence to the river Ganga and to Kashi that we see across both Pallava and Chalukyas and across the country. So everybody wants to create a Kashi in their kingdom. That is how much Kashi meant to them and how connected they were to Banaras, that, they would say that, for instance, the Chalukyas in Pattadakalu said, this is like the Kashi of our kingdom. And the nearby river Malprabha is our Ganga. So Kashi was such a wonderful place that, people wanted to replicate it. And this reverence existed pan-India. And even when we look at the kind of, yagyas or rituals that they did, we see a mention of the Ashwamedha Yagya, Rajasuya Yagya. These were the kind of things, the duties of a king. And we see that across pan-India. So there is a cultural continuity across India, and you'll be surprised to find, Vivekji, that not just across India in the 6th to 8th century, even southeast in Cambodia, all the way to Cambodia, we had the same Sanatani kind of a culture. Because in Cambodia, there was this Vaishnava and Shaiva temples being built. The capital of the country was called Hariharalaya. The name of the king was, stylized according to like the name of the Pallava kings that we see. So it was a cultural continuum. So by default, we had a similar Shastraic corpus underlying it, and then that would just be built upon based on different aesthetic sensibilities. So it was a cultural continuum. Bharat was not broken up in that sense. So that's what
In your book, I read that somewhere is written that Pallavas thought that they were connected to Dronacharya and Ashwatthama. Yeah, what is the history behind that? For my personal thing, I want to understand that.
So I
Because
think
Dronacharya and Pallavas, how they can be connected?
So each kingdom drew its lineage. There's always the question of legitimacy, right? So each kingdom drew its lineage in a particular way, and the Pallavas believed that they were descendants of Dronacharya. So, and it starts from the depiction will show it starts all the way from Vishnu and then leading down all the way to Dronacharya and then his son Ashwatthama, and that the first Pallava was actually the son of Ashwatthama. Again, belief. Nobody knows where they came from. There are multiple theories behind where the Pallavas came from. The most commonly thought about is that they were the progeny of a Chola king and a Naga princess. But it's also believed they could have been the Pahlavas, who are also mentioned in Mahabharata, but we don't know. Or they could have come from Andhra, we don't know. So somewhere it's lost in the sands of time. But C. Meenakshi, who actually did her entire thesis, and she was the first woman PhD from University of Madras. All the way in the 1930s, she wrote her thesis, and a lot of the history of Pallavas we know is because of her work. To become to get a doctorate degree in the 30s as a woman, a great achievement, definitely. And she studied, the Vaikunta Perumal temple, the sculptures in the kind of closed corridor that is there, where Nandivarma Pallava has etched the history of the Pallava kingdom completely in that corridor. And she studied panel by panel and then brought out the various elements of the kings. So she said these are the multiple theories that run behind where the Pallavas came from. At the end of the day, what matters is they were a strong kingdom which established these techniques of constructing temples from rock. In fact, Mahendravarma Pallava's sculpt has an inscription in Mandagapattu in his first rock cut temple where he says, "I am forsaking these perishable materials and choosing rock to leave a legacy." So she actually said they could have come from anywhere. These are the various theories around where they came from. But they themselves believed that they were descendants of Dronacharya. Just like a lot of the North Indian kingdoms claim, "Main Raghuvamshi hu, main Suryavamshi hu, I'm direct lineage of Mama," and so on and so forth. So,
but it's a good angle, it's a good perspective, Bharat, and why I highlighted this especially, because normally people think, okay, the South kingdoms and North kingdoms have always been away and there is no connection and there is no communication, and which is true also because this is the way we are taught also. Our education has very strong regional boundaries, and so normally we only learn more or less about that. So
yeah,
and
well, that part of it has been debunked multiple times, including the references to Hindu gods in Sangam literature or in Silapadikaram. So that's to say that this was a little separate from the rest of the country is no longer actually valid. Of course, vested interests continue to harp on that division.
Okay. So see, I've read the whole thing. I made lots of notes. I can talk a lot about it. If I have to do a solo session, I can do on this book, But I want people to buy it and keep it, It's a good book to, it should be in your library on your shelf. You guys have the book with you right now?
No, I'm traveling somewhere, so
Okay, chalo, this is a screenshot worthy. Let me take a screenshot with this. It's wonderful. Let me just 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So I want people to buy this and read it, and if anybody can't afford it, you can write to me. I can give few books definitely. But why?
Thank you, Vivekji. Thank you so much.
Why? I'll tell you why. There's a strong reason for that. You must have experienced it, but I experienced some 8-10 years ago. Khajuraho specifically, I'm talking about. Okay. When I was young, I grew up in Bhopal. So, the director of Archaeological Survey of India was a very good friend of ours. In fact, his son is my childhood friend. We grew up together. MD Khare. And his brother-in-law is BK Lal, Mr. Lal, Archaeological.
Yes.
Yeah, so this entire family was into Indian architecture, temples, archaeology, and all that. And for generations, in fact, his wife and his cousins, everybody was in archaeological survey. And he wrote a book on Bagh Ki Gufaएं. In Hindi, he wrote Bagh is a place in Madhya Pradesh, and there are some very ancient caves and the paintings and all that. He wrote a book. And he was a specialist in temples. He specialized, he understood temples. He spent all his life studying temples as a subject. His doctorate was also in that subject. And when he used to come to my house, I was small. Young means I was in 10th or 11th. When you are in rebellious mode, you don't want to believe anything. And he used to say that a lot of temples, when all these sculptors would come in the morning, and then together they would sit and meditate. And they collectively visualized something, whatever the task was, I don't remember exact word. They visualized, and then they picked up the rock, and there was God inside it, and they just took out the extra thing. But he said it in such a fascinating manner. I thought it was just, crap, and this is like a story he's building up. How is it possible that hundreds of thousands of people sit together and meditate and they see the same thing, they go and carve it? And I think believing is in seeing. Only when I started traveling a few years ago, 7, 8, 10 years ago, and in Khajuraho, the same thing. It fascinates me to see all those. Have you seen there is this woman who has just come out of shower, and the small droplets, flowing out of her hair, and then she has got a mirror, and then she has got a very sheer, thin something on her legs, and that is also wet because the drops have fallen on that. And then they have got mirrors and such intricate work in that, and all cut from one single rock. And that is something, it's unbelievable, because if it was, why can't we do it today? Why don't we do it today? And why?
I'll give you one nice anecdote, which we also didn't know. If you see the book, Shashikala Anandji would have written something about the book in the endorsement section. She actually studied under a very famous Sthapati of Tamil Nadu. And she was, during the book launch, she actually told us that the chisel which was there would blunt in 1 hour. So if you're working on it, you're sculpting, that blunts in an hour. So there's actually a whole factory of chisels standing behind. There are people standing behind with replacements while they go and sharpen this and bring it back. So one chisel, one of those things that you're describing, where the droplet can be seen and she's come out of the shell. So one guy working on that, in an hour, his chisel goes blunt. He asks for another comes, another hour. And like this, everybody working around the temple. And how many of them would have been there? You can imagine, for a temple of that scale and size, that there was an entire factory actually serving this entire process.
And so such imagine they brought all these rocks.
The sculptor is also a devotee. That's something that I've tried to put in the book.
So that's what I was trying to come to. Absolutely. That. That's what I was saying. So what I understood was that it is not possible. See, I don't know. It's a very Indian cultural thought. जैसे कहते हैं कि अगर प्यार से खाना बनाते हैं तो पता चल जाता है कि प्यार से बनाया गया. Even if you don't see the किसी के घर जाते हैं तो भाई उनकी वाइफ और माएँ कई बार नहीं आती हैं सामने फ्रॉम द किचन, यू नो, स्पेशली इन यूपी इट हैपेंस बिकॉज दीज आर बिग हाउसेस, वो लोग बना के भेज देती हैं, मर्द लोग खा के निकल जाते हैं, बट इवन मेकआउट की प्यार से बनाया गया कि नहीं गया है। अब इसको यू बाय लॉजिक एंड साइंस आई कैन नॉट प्रूव इट, बट आई नो सिमिलरली when I go to these temples, especially in Himalayas, it is impossible for me to believe now for my entire life that they could have been built by non-spiritual people. It is impossible. If you have not discovered that creative consciousness, it is impossible unless and until you become one with that. In China also, I was told that when Buddhist monks traveled from India, so they carried Indian philosophy there. And then they started the painters. At that time, they used to paint these hyper reality paintings, you know, where you see a tree and you cannot make out whether it's a real tree or it's an artificial tree from a distance, you know, if you put it in the nature, like a mirror. And that came because these monks taught them that you go and sit in front of a tree and just meditate until you become a tree with your eyes open, until you become the tree. So when you become that, what you are going to create, and there is no disparity between the creator and the created. When you are in that divine state of mind, then you do it. And as a creative person, I can say it happens in when you are writing, you are making movies, or you are creating song. It happens. For a mother, when she is raising a child, that happens. When you're in love with somebody for the first time, as the purest form of love, it happens. You feel that oneness. That feeling of self-abandonment means you have surrendered your ego and yourself to the cause or the creation which you are part of. I get exactly the same vibe, same feelings when I travel to these temples. And therefore, I don't need anybody to prove to me that these are just created. And that's why what I was told in 10th and 11th by this great person, okay, I actually thought about him and I believed him instantly. And I said, he was right. It was not a fantasy story. It was not glorifying of Hindu architecture. Did you guys feel something like that, that spiritual divine connection in these places when you were in the campus, the compound?
Yeah, Vivek ji. So, what, for example, I also could find out is that even before they would begin sculpting, they would have this puja. You know, they would pray to their kul devata to bless them, and you know, even as Shashikala ji pointed out, that many of these sthapatis were not, for example, Shaivas. You know, they belong to a different sect, but they were able to create the most beautiful depictions of Shiva on the temple. And that can only happen when you are able to understand that this Shiva that I am kind of constructing is just another manifestation of the same divinity that I'm praying to. And they would do that. So even when they would cast bronze statues by the Cholas, they would have an elaborate ritual where they will put the cast, they will pray to the Devi to kind of come and bless their creation, and then they will kind of, you know, remove the mold and clean it. So even in every step, they would have some connection with the divinity that they are trying to portray.
Okay, tell
And
me
these
something.
people are
These
learned people.
Jain temples, I want to know these Jain temples, how they came about to be so close to all these temples. In Hampi also, I've seen there are lots of Jain temples there. In a whole lot of places, if you
So,
see. Is this
so
because we
Jain,
were aligned in the same
so
ecosystem or?
the same sthapatis were building these temples. Okay, so it was
Oh,
not that,
got
you
it.
know, different same sculptors, they would understand the concept. For instance, if they are making an image of Parshvanath, who's a Tirthankar, they will understand what is his iconography. They will look at some precedents, and then it is ultimately their creativity that comes out. Okay, so there will definitely be a Jain Acharya involved in the process, closely involved, but
Okay.
it's the same set of people. So even when you look at the Chalukyan kind of, like what they patronize Jain viharas. At the same time, they patronize Shaiva and Vaishnava temples. So the same kind of people who would have worked in that city, they would have constructed all these temples. So we did not have
And
this dichotomy of Hinduism and Jainism per se. That was not there.
And there were, contrary to the view that we didn't document things, these were actually fairly well documented techniques. There were, from a Vastu Shastra perspective, Shilpasara, Manasara, Ishana Shivaguru Paddhati, Brihat Samhita, Varaha Mihira's Brihat Samhita itself documents some 20 different styles of temples. So
Okay.
they were written down and available also for And Rajasthan had a specific style, again written down. So
Yes.
the concepts, the techniques, and the structures were actually fairly well documented for people to take forward. It's a different thing that we haven't maintained and studied and continued it. Again, one of the things that we've lost over over time. But yes, they were very well documented.
Even now, there are millions of manuscripts lying, of in various regional Prakrits and Sanskrits lying that nobody has really taken a look at. So this is
So, for
something
example,
that we need to
Shukraniti,
do on war footing. Yeah.
the Shukraniti gives you, Murti's exact dimensions. Matha kitna bada hona chahiye?
Oh,
How much is
really?
the distance to the
Yes.
nose? Yeah, how much is the distance to the chin, to the chest, to the navel, so on and so forth. How long should the fingers be? How big should the palm be? All those details are documented.
I think this excellence in sculpting. I have traveled the entire world. I don't go to. I have a phobia from shopping, so I don't can't enter a shop. So I just end up in museums and historical places and monuments. I do that a lot. I have never seen this level of sculpting like you find in ancient Indian temples. It's unbelievable. The science, the technology, and I'm so proud. More I travel, more proud I become every single time. But now, then finally, it's been an hour. Pata bhi nahi chala. Finally, what I want to understand from both of you, because now you are authorities in this subject.
Oh,
Okay, no, you are more authority than me and a lot of people who are listening. Most of the people who are listening, because you have done a great job. Your book is not propaganda. Your book is not trying to prove anything. It's so beautifully done. Once I read it, in fact, now when I take my kids to Mahabalipuram, I can tell them why it's called Seven Pagodas or stuff like that. All those kind of detailing. But now I want to understand. Now we in last few years, I know this has been always there since I was a student. Everybody used to speak about free temples, free temples, free temples. We won't get into too much of political part of it, but now there is something called temple politics. Okay, because there are people who want it done in a certain way, some people don't want it in a certain way. So it's like a new startup of Indian politics. Sadhguru is on one tangent, BJP is on another tangent, RSS is on no tangent there. They don't have any say in that matter. Then there are lots of small factions and groups. They are running their own campaigns. Why can't we simply declare them, all the ancient temples, as national heritage? Okay, all of them, and let the local communities take care of those temples and take this tradition forward. What is the point of saying this is our tradition if it is not going forward? Then you are talking about dead traditions, right? Then you're talking about dead traditions. Like Taj Mahal, for example, is a dead tradition because nobody in modern world is ever going to build a monument for his wife or something like that. So if that is the tradition, that's the story which is told when you go to Agra. कि ये इसकी खासियत ये कि ये इस tradition से आया है. Thought was that you build it for your wife और अपना मकबरा अंदर बनाओ. पर अब वो तो नहीं कर सकते हैं. अब आप किले नहीं बना सकते हैं आज की तारीख में because the tradition of kings is gone and the attack on किला. तो आज किला नहीं कर सकते हैं. But this is one tradition which gives me spiritual experience. Okay, it also portrays the art and heritage and the culture of your this thing. It is also social for the local social ecosystem. And if I have marriages, if I have janeu, if I have any kind of a event, I can, instead of taking people to banquet halls, I can invite people there. That tradition is slowly dying. And these are good traditions. These are not the traditions which divide people. These are traditions which unite people, keep you rooted. And in the times of globalization, I think the biggest challenge is that all of us are becoming uniform in our approach to social justice. Simply means justice done to a particular society. So every society is different. So social justice laws also have to be different, isn't it? But we are trying to make them uniform, and because of the social media, and you know how the whole market of social media and globalization is working today, it has become very critical. If Hindu philosophy, Hindu tradition, Hindu art, Hindu culture has to survive, right, then it is very, very important that we also revive these traditions, let things happen the way they happen. So if we follow that tradition, like in China, for example, there is no Chinese civilization.
Yeah.
We keep saying, if you go to Google, they will say, yes, Chinese civilization. What is China? It's a Mongol civilization, Chinese, today's China is a communist China, right? So same thing can happen with us also, India also, that after 500 years or 100 years or 200 years, we will call ourselves Hindu civilization while sipping Coca-Cola, drinking McDonald's, and visiting cathedrals in Europe, and visiting Louvre, and writing about everything which is Western, and we'll call our Hindu civilization without practicing anything which is coming from that tradition. So therefore, I would like your point of view on this, that yes, temples should be free. If they have to be free, then who's going to control them? Who's going to run them? That's what, when I spoke to government officers, that's what the top leadership of political leadership, when I speak to them, they say, yes, okay, we leave the control. Now some trust is going to run it, or some local industrialist is going to run it. Who's going to run it, and what are you going to do with the temples, which we are not doing right now? At least we are taking this money, using it for public service and for public works and development of the neighboring areas. What are you going to do with that? That's their question.
So I'll give you an example of Chidambaram Temple. Chidambaram Temple is no longer under government control. It's managed by the Dikshitars. They won the case in the court in 2015, I think, where they wrenched back control of the temple from the government. And when you say the temple, Kovil, in Tamil Nadu, it means Chidambaram Temple, because Chidambaram is such an important temple that it's got the epithet of the temple. So it's taken back control. And if you see the activities that the Dikshitars do, and particularly did during COVID times, they supported so many villages with regular food distribution, making sure nobody went hungry. They would pack up food, travel to so many villages in and around, and made sure that nobody in that vicinity had to go through trouble during COVID times. The management of these temples has been very clearly laid down in the agamic structures by which these temples are governed. Who takes care of what, how much of expense towards a particular item, what are the things to be patronized, what are the festivals that need to be held in the temple, who needs to get involved in these temples. And it is not, there is no, how to say, injustice in any of these texts which mandate that, somebody needs to be excluded. There is a role and a purpose for everybody. In fact, during the Chidambaram festival, the deity is brought out and actually handed over to the local fishermen, because they need to conduct their rites to the deity, and they keep the deity for a whole night, and then come back and give it back to the temple authority, saying, we are done with the rituals that we had to do. You can take the Lord back into the temple premises. So I think all of this is already fairly well documented and written down. We are deliberately not looking into those elements. And secondly, to say that the control for a secular government official to come and say, what is it that you are going to do that we are not going to do? We are not going to take the money out of the hundi and then transfer it to some other activity which is not related to anything of this particular religion. Firstly, we are not going to do that. And that is a very crucial thing. You cannot dictate a secular policy on top of a religious institution like this. It's just not done. Where is it done anywhere else in the world? It's not done anywhere else in the world apart from this country. Nowhere else. And so that question itself arising is, again, these are all spins of arguments that keep thrown about, saying uh, you what is it that you're going to do, who do we hand over to? You don't need to hand over to anybody apart from the Shivacharya who's handling a Shiva temple, or a Vaishnava or a Bhattacharya who's handling the Vishnu temple, and he will put the structure in place. And typically they will not exceed their authority because they follow the scripture to the letter, and that has given a path for them to be within their limits and not go beyond. It's a how to say, it's a deliberate imposition, Vivek ji. Ye matlab, they're scaring us every time, saying what will happen. Actually nothing will happen. They will run fine. They will set up institutions for the community. They'll set up from everything from hospitals to educational institutions to community halls to everything. They will patronize a lot more economic activity in that region. You will see a lot of growth and flourishing of the local ecosystem that you don't see today, because that land is taken away and given off to other nefarious purposes. You will actually see true development.
And my fight is not with the idea of secularism. My problem is with the way secularism is being defined and practiced in our country.
Yeah, absolutely.
If secularism is true secularism, then Bharat, give me one reason why government should be in religion. What business government has got to do with religion?
Absolutely.
This current thing that's happening in Tamil Nadu is just a very good example of that. They are deciding who will be the acharya responsible for the rituals. It's not coming from within the community. They are pushing. So this is what happens. Like tomorrow they can come and tell you that this ritual should be stopped, which is being done. For instance, in Ujjain, they're not allowing you to use milk or beyond a certain quality of milk on the Shivalinga because they think it is eroding the Shivalinga. There is everything in place. If the Shivalinga erodes, how to do a reconsecration, how to replace that. There is a system for everything. So they will come and interfere in every aspect, in every ritual. They will tell you, for instance, that this kind of procession cannot be done. They will sanction the money that has been paid by Hindu devotees for that temple. It is
okay. Now let me just visualize a scenario. We are a secular country. We are a democracy. Correct? And there is a possibility. There might be a possibility because of coalition compulsion or some kind of mathematics of politics. Suppose tomorrow there is a Muslim or a Christian prime minister in India or government, which is quite a possibility in 50 years, 30 years, 40 years. It's quite a possibility in 50, 60 years. Or wo hoga. Yes. Nobody can stop it because there will be so much of pressure because of globalization, okay, to prove our credentials that we are indeed a secular country so that big tech companies can invest here and do business. We'll be forced to show our credentials by doing some stupid thing like that. It will happen. I can visualize it. Or if it happens, remember me, whether I'm on this earth or not. Okay. So if that happens, then what is happening is that you have given all the control to a person. Okay. Now the test would be whether he's interested in it or not. What if he's not? So this is not true secularism. Secularism simply means that our temples should be free and government should have no business with that. What we do we do a good job with it or we just do something hell with it, doesn't matter. Leave it to us. Like we do not interfere in other matters. Nobody should interfere. That's what my take is. That's what I think. Why do you have to ask question, what are you going to do with it? We have done it for last 5,000, 10,000, whatever number of years. We'll do the same thing. Right? Anyway, so Bharat and Gurpreet, now tahe dil se aapko dhanyawad deta hu. I am really, really delighted that you have done such great work. Quickly tell me what's next. Now you are going to cover more temples or you are going to diversify into something else? Are you going to write a next book or not?
Definitely we want to. So definitely we want to, but there are a few other things that we are, I think, okay, we wrote the book, but I think there's a lot more we need to learn also. I mean, we are, again, both of us are city kids, not very different from other city kids, perhaps different age groups, but definitely come from a background which is and an education system that kind of decoupled us from the roots, and we are clawing back into it, learning a lot of stuff. So I think we're doing a lot more courses now, and I think Indica offers a few courses that are kind of helping us connect back. So one of the courses we are doing is actually temple management in the Agamas. Dr. Deepa Duraiswamy, who wrote her book on temple management in the Agamas, has done a superb job, and we're picking up a lot of stuff from that. So I think next few months, at least for me, will be to pick up, learn, go deeper into some of these subjects before I finally decide on what to write next.
Great, so wonderful. So let me just tell you, people who don't know, you see this name here, Indica, and so Indica has brought this book out, and they also have brought many other books also out, and Indica basically is doing a great job when it comes to Indic Renaissance. I think if India has to become Vishwaguru, it's time that we begin something called Indic Renaissance. No government is going to do that. Governments get vote on religion, very pop religion, but governments never do anything for culture. In 70 years, no government has done anything for Indian culture. If somebody is seriously interested, so it has to come from the society. And I think it's a great initiative by Indica to publish this book. And I would like to see more and more books like this. Wish you guys all the best. Write more books.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Vivekji. Thank you so much for
Sure, and if you are ever in Bombay,
some time on your show.
No, Bharat, if you are ever in Mumbai, then
Thank you
let's
so
do a
much,
live
Vivek.
podcast. Gurpreet,
Sure,
Bharat, if you are ever in Mumbai, please let me know. I'll invite you to my studio. I have a small studio where
Sure,
we can
definitely.
put
Thank
3-4
you so
cameras
much,
and shoot a nice podcast.
Done.
Absolutely. Will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks for watching this, friends. I do these podcasts with authors who are doing revolutionary work, new work, original work, great work. And this is all done. It's brought to you by I Am Buddha Foundation. I Am Buddha Foundation helps young creative Indians, and the objective is to bring about Indic Renaissance. You guys can go to I Am Buddha website, and if you want, you can financially contribute and help us to bring out more and more sessions like this. Thank you very much.